Battle at Rangiritiri was a major invasion which took place in the Waikato region from the 20th of November to the 21st in 1863 between the British forces and the iwi of Ngāti Napi. The expansion of British settlement and colonial rule into the shelling of Meremere with the British attack Rangiritiri with around 1,450 soldiers from the 65th, 12th and 14th regiments along with artillery batteries, 2 gunboats, and at the time Rangiritiri was occupied by about 500 Kingitangan warriors, which included men, women and children. They were led by King Tawhio, and after the attack, the party at Rangiritiri was reinforced by about 400 Kingitangan warriors led by Wiremu Tamahana Te Tarapipipi Te Waharoa, and they defended and fought from the east side only to surrender after a courageous attempt to fend off the British. Unfortunately, they were outnumbered and they were forced towards Lake Kōwhera, and many of their lives were taken. Wiremu Tamahana and King Tawhio were at Rangiritiri at the beginning of the battle, and they left later after the battle was in full swing. Wiremu was in opposition to the Waikato conflict and didn't want to fight the British. Instead, he was convinced by his people to return to Rangiritiri with a large party of reinforcements, only to turn back as he realised that the Rangiritiri defenders had already surrendered. The battle cost both sides more than any other engagement of the Waikato Wars, and also resulted in the capture of 180 Māori prisoners from Ngāti Mauta, Te Patsipo, Te Ngaunga, Te Kawero, Ngāti Puniawe, Ngāti Pukiriwai, Ngāti Taha, Ngāti Tonganu, Ngāti Mahuta, Patsipoan, Ngāti Haua o Ngāti Uriaruru, Ngāti Te Ata, Ngāti Hinu, Ngāti Amaruru, and Tainu, which impacted on the subsequent loss of the land in the Waikato region. After the battle at Rangiritiri, individual graves were dug for the British soldiers, with the leaders getting decorated headstones, while the Māori who died at Rangiritiri were given a singular mass grave in the corner of the cemetery. Toko Horoi, Great Totorewa's son, spoke about the understanding of the mass graves at the Urupa. You see, the individual graves for each and every single one of those individual graves belongs to British soldiers, and then you see this one mass grave, and in that mass grave lies the bodies of our ancestors. And to me, that's a sign of inequality, racism, and all the type of stuff that still exists today. The bones of the Māori who were shot down by the British attempting to escape to the Lake Kōwhera still remain there at the bottom of the lake, with the rahui on the lake only was seen last year in 2022 by the King Tuheitia Pōtakou Rerowhero II. The consequences of the loss of Rangiritiri and Rangiawhia ended in the confiscation of 1,202,172 acres of tidal land from the Waikato and multiple acts that enabled further confiscation of Māori land. After Rangiritiri fell, there was a continuation of British invasion with the rest of the Waikato led by Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron and his soldiers. A few months after Rangiritiri, Rangiawhia or Rangihia was at the time a thriving village at the east of Te Awamutu. This village was considered as being a very productive Māori fishing station, where the locals supplied many iwi such as Ngāti Hinetu and Ngāti Apakura. Only a church remains there as a reminder of one of the most horrific war crimes ever recorded by the Crown against the Māori in New Zealand history. At the time, the Kingitanga was sacked while the warriors were away guarding Paperangi, which was the most fortified part in the entire Waikato world. Today, these atrocities and invasions are well documented by the Māori through their own versions of stories in motiaka, haka, and books written by their own people like Rangiritiri Walker. Purchases of Māori land by the Crown continued from 1847 to 1860, and after 1860, further land was confiscated up until the early 1900s. Much of the land was confiscated after the multiple New Zealand wars. This was because of the British invading and taking control using their own intentions of stealing Māori land. The land confiscation. It was shocking how Māori were stripped of everything. Many Māori were faced with allegations of being rebellious. If the chief confronted such taking of land and were accused of going against the Queen of the English, Queen Victoria, and quickly lost their rights to occupy their own land. In Taranaki, a whole district was confiscated on the 31st of January 1865. Another legislation called the New Zealand Suppression of Rebellion Act was passed on November the 21st of 1863 after nearly a decade of conflict, starting with the Puketaki intertribal conflict that started in Taranaki and escalated to conflict with the government in Kupapa Iwi and Taranaki that started in 1860 to 1863 that ended up in the loss of over 1,000 lives. The Act stated that the government had the authority to take the most vigorous and effective measures to suppress said rebellion in any part of the colony which shall appear necessary for the public safety. Legislations and acts of British law. This control and takeover was put by the British government through legislations and laws by giving the authority to men like Cameron, who was commander of the Imperial Forces in New Zealand from 1861 to 1865. His job was to uphold legislation and law and deal with trespassing and intrusion on Crown land. The New Zealand Settlement Act of December 3rd, 1863 allowed the government to confiscate any land from Iwi by judgment of the Crown. The legislations gave the British government the authority to confiscate Māori land, and over time, the government confiscated over 4 million acres of New Zealand land. Through the passing of more legislations and armed campaigns throughout the 1800s, for example, the Suppression of Rebellion Act meant that Māori chiefs had nothing to stand on. And when it came to protecting their land and their people, legislation like the Tohunga Suppression Act stopped Māori from using traditional healing practices. The Native Land Act in 1873 gave the ability to fragment land ownership for Māori. And the Native Schools Act in 1867 required instruction in English schools, even though there was no official policy banning children who were Māori speakers. It was forbidden to speak their own native language, and eventually these type of acts gave Māori less and less in a short time. The ration of land being taken continues today. Māori only own about 2.7 to 6.7% on New Zealand's land, as opposed to the entire country before Pākehā Aurora. Statistics show that 56% of New Zealand's land isn't confiscated, isn't acquired, and is now privately owned and isn't required to be returned to Māori through the Waitangi Tribunal. 3.3% is foreign owned and 28% is public land. During and after the Waikato Wars, local iwi were forced to exile out of the Waikato, and neighbouring iwi, Ngāti Maniapuko, took them in. For 25 years, the people of the Waikato lived with Ngāti Maniapuko before they returned to the Waikato. The region King Country was named after King Tāwhiao because he was exiled there and remained off limits to Pākehā until the 1800s. It is interesting how these lands that were wrongfully taken still remain in private ownership. Many Māori are landless and have had huge suffering. Many tribes became very poor, lived in crowded and unhealthy conditions, and this brought about disease and early death to many. Over the generations, Māori culture, language, and loss of land took its toll. A Māori Renaissance for the revival and fortunes of the Māori of New Zealand began in the 1970s until 1914 and possibly later. A perception of the Māori race, although dying out, was that it was capable and worthy of saving. The Māori fought back with the European system and challenged their rights by challenging the Treaty of the Waitangi Agreement. The great landmarch that took place on September 1975 to the 13th of October in 1975 was a march of 5,000 led by Te Rōpū Mapakite and Dame Whinapu, who walked over 1,000 kilometres from the very top of the North Island all the way down to Wellington to protest the 100-year-long alienation of Māori land and Māori people and the removal and restrictions of Māori culture. To quote, "Not one more acre," was said by Dame Whinapu during the march. This land march was the beginning of the Renaissance for Māori culture and to take back what was stolen. Today, there are still groups in New Zealand and even New Zealand politics who are against the revitalisation of Māori culture and practices. Rangihi was one of many invasions that took place in the Waikato, where many Māori people were ruthlessly evicted and evacuated from their own land and homes. At the end of this, I feel annoyed and disgusted that only after 150 years, Māori culture and practices are only just now coming back into the light. And the fact that this type of segregation and suppression is still present in New Zealand politics is just outright wrong. The laws that were put in place in the 1800s prevented the previous generations from speaking Māori, learning their whakapapa, and stopping them from connecting with the past. Tēnā koutou.